This is not about trade disputes that can be resolved through negotiation. This is not about tariffs that get imposed and then withdrawn after both sides make concessions. This is about a fundamental shift in supply chain orientation that is already happening, and that American officials are discovering they cannot reverse through pressure or threats or diplomatic initiatives. Canada is redirecting critical mineral exports away from the United States, not as retaliation for specific trade actions, not as a temporary bargaining tactic, as a strategic reorientation based on the recognition that Canadian processing capacity is more valuable than American market access, that Asian and European customers offer better terms than American manufacturers, that diversifying away from dependence on a single customer provides more security than maintaining traditional supply relationships. The rage you see from American officials, and the specific fury attributed to figures like Trump, comes from the realization that this shift cannot be stopped. The tools that would normally be used to pressure a smaller neighbor into reversing course, trade restrictions, diplomatic isolation, threatening language from senior officials, these tools do not work when the smaller neighbor controls something essential that cannot be sourced elsewhere at scale. And the timing of this realization makes the fury more intense. American officials spent years warning about dependency on Chinese processing for critical minerals. They funded initiatives to build domestic alternatives. They negotiated with allies to develop non-Chinese supply chains. But while focusing on the China problem, they failed to notice that their assumed solution, Canadian processing capacity, was becoming independent of American control. The country they thought of as a reliable alternative to China was making independent decisions that did not automatically prioritize American interests. This is what generates the specific emotional response we see. Not just concern about supply chain security, but the recognition that assumptions about Canadian reliability were based on outdated power dynamics. The belief that Canada would naturally align with American preferences because of geography, alliance relationships, and economic integration. The discovery that this belief no longer describes reality is forcing a fundamental reassessment of how America engages with its closest neighbor. Let me be specific about what is actually happening, so this is concrete rather than abstract. Canadian processing facilities that produce battery-grade lithium hydroxide, rare earth elements for defense applications, nickel sulfate for electric vehicle batteries, and graphite for semiconductor manufacturing have begun signing long-term supply agreements with Chinese, European, and Asian customers that guarantee those customers priority access to Canadian output. These agreements were negotiated quietly over the past 18 months. They became visible only when American manufacturers started experiencing delays in Canadian supply deliveries and discovered that Canadian facilities were operating at full capacity but prioritizing other customers. When American officials inquired about restoring priority access, Canadian officials indicated that existing contracts prevented immediate accommodation of American requests. The specific language used in these interactions is telling. Canadian officials did not say they were choosing other customers over American ones. They simply indicated that capacity was fully allocated under existing commitments and that new contracts would need to compete with existing arrangements. This neutral commercial framing made it difficult for American officials to characterize the situation as hostile or politically motivated. Canada was not punishing America. Canada was treating America like any other customer in a supply-constrained market. But from the American perspective, being treated like any other customer represents a dramatic change in status. For decades, American manufacturers received preferential treatment from Canadian suppliers. Priority access during shortages, favorable pricing, flexible contract terms. This preferential treatment was so consistent that it became invisible, simply the expected baseline for how the relationship worked. The shift to equal treatment feels like discrimination, even though it is actually the removal of previous American privilege. This is the source of the fury. Not a dramatic announcement or a public confrontation, but the quiet discovery that supply arrangements Americans assumed were permanent had been restructured without American input or consent. That Canadian companies had made independent decisions to diversify their customer base in ways that reduced American priority. That these decisions were already locked into multi-year contracts that could not be easily broken. The multi-year duration of these contracts is particularly significant. Canadian suppliers are not just selling on spot markets where prices and allocation can change monthly. They are committing to long-term relationships that lock in supply patterns for 5, 7, sometimes 10 years into the future. American manufacturers who assumed they could always access Canadian supplies are discovering that the supply is already committed to other buyers for the next decade. By the time these contracts expire, the global supply landscape will have changed in ways that are impossible to predict now. American officials have tried to determine exactly how much Canadian capacity has been redirected and to which countries. The numbers are difficult to pin down because Canadian companies consider contract details commercially confidential and are not required to disclose customer allocation publicly. But industry analysts estimate that between 30 and 40% of Canadian critical mineral processing capacity that was previously oriented toward American customers is now committed to Asian and European buyers through long-term contracts signed in the past 2 years. 30 to 40% may not sound like a majority, but in a supply-constrained market where demand exceeds capacity by substantial margins, losing access to 30 to 40% of expected supply creates immediate shortages and forces manufacturers to compete on spot markets at much higher prices. American battery manufacturers who planned production around assumed Canadian supply are discovering they need to revise plans, delay expansion, or source from Chinese suppliers they were trying to avoid for strategic reasons. Now, let me explain why this redirection is happening and why it represents a permanent shift rather than a temporary adjustment. Canadian mining companies and processing facilities have spent 20 years building infrastructure and developing expertise that makes them essential suppliers of materials required for electric vehicles, renewable energy, advanced electronics, and defense systems. This infrastructure was built partly to serve American customers, but also with the understanding that global demand for these materials was growing faster than American demand alone. As electric vehicle production accelerated in China and Europe, as Asian electronics manufacturers expanded, as European renewable energy deployment increased, Canadian suppliers recognized they had multiple customers competing for limited processing capacity. The economic logic of this situation is straightforward. If demand exceeds supply, suppliers can choose customers who offer the best terms. And the best terms are not necessarily offered by the closest geographic customer. Chinese battery manufacturers have been willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed lithium supply and have offered advance payments that reduce financial risk for Canadian producers. European automotive companies have signed agreements that include technology sharing and joint development of next-generation battery chemistries. Asian electronics manufacturers have committed to long-term contracts with price floors that protect Canadian suppliers from market volatility. These contract structures provide Canadian suppliers with financial security that American-style contracts do not offer. The advance payments provide capital for facility expansion without requiring external financing. The technology sharing provides access to next-generation battery research that Canadian companies can leverage for future competitive advantage. The price floors protect against market downturns that could otherwise threaten profitability during periods of oversupply. American manufacturers, by contrast, have generally assumed that Canadian supplies would remain available on favorable terms because of geographic proximity and traditional trade relationships. This assumption led to less aggressive contracting and less willingness to offer the kind of terms that would guarantee priority access in a supply-constrained market. American contracts typically include pricing tied to market conditions, which transfers risk to suppliers. They rarely include advance payments or technology sharing. They are often shorter duration, providing less long-term security. From a Canadian supplier perspective, the choice between an American contract offering market-based pricing with no advance payment versus a Chinese contract offering fixed pricing with 30% advance payment is not difficult. The Chinese contract is simply better business. This is true even accounting for the additional shipping costs to Asia and the complexity of working with customers in different time zones and regulatory environments. The contract terms are strong enough to overcome geographic disadvantage. The result is that Canadian suppliers have increasingly oriented toward customers who value their output more highly and demonstrate that value through contract terms. This is not anti-American sentiment or political retaliation. This is straightforward business logic. Suppliers sell to customers who offer the best combination of price, contract security, and relationship terms. American officials have been slow to recognize this dynamic because they have been accustomed to thinking about Canada as a dependent partner whose economic interests align automatically with American preferences. The assumption was that Canadian resource exports would naturally flow south because American markets are large and American demand is substantial. This assumption is breaking down because Canadian suppliers now have alternatives that are as attractive or more attractive than American customers. Let me give you specific examples of how this plays out in practice. A Canadian lithium processing facility in Quebec produces battery-grade lithium hydroxide. Annual capacity is limited. Demand from global battery manufacturers exceeds annual capacity by substantial margins. The facility must choose which customers receive priority allocation. A Chinese battery manufacturer offers a 5-year contract at fixed prices with advance payment covering 30% of contract value. A European automotive company offers technology sharing on next-generation solid-state battery research, plus guaranteed minimum purchases. An American battery maker offers standard commercial terms with quarterly pricing adjustments based on market conditions. The Canadian facility signs the Chinese and European contracts. The American manufacturer is told that remaining capacity will be allocated on a spot market basis with no guarantee of consistent supply. The American company complains to government officials. The government officials contact Canadian counterparts. The Canadian government indicates that private companies make independent commercial decisions and that government does not interfere in contract negotiations. This pattern is repeating across multiple facilities and multiple materials. Rare earth processing in Saskatchewan is prioritizing Asian electronics manufacturers over American defense contractors. Nickel refining in Ontario is signing long-term agreements with European battery makers. Graphite processing is allocating capacity to customers willing to commit to multi-year contracts with favorable terms. The cumulative effect is that American manufacturers, who assumed they would have reliable access to Canadian processing, are discovering that access is no longer guaranteed. That Canadian suppliers are treating American customers the same way they treat any other customer, based on commercial terms rather than geographic proximity or alliance relationships. This is what generates fury from American officials, not because Canada is doing anything unprecedented or unreasonable, but because the shift contradicts assumptions about how the relationship is supposed to work. In the traditional framework, Canada supplies resources, and America provides markets and security guarantees. Canadian suppliers are expected to prioritize American customers because America is the essential partner. This framework is collapsing because Canadian suppliers have discovered they do not need to prioritize American customers to achieve commercial success. Now, let me address why American officials cannot simply force Canada to reverse this redirection through trade pressure or diplomatic threats. The standard approach would be to threaten tariffs on Canadian exports unless Canada guarantees American priority access to critical mineral processing. This approach fails because Canadian suppliers can redirect to other markets if American markets become less attractive due to tariffs. If the United States imposes tariffs on Canadian lithium exports, Canadian producers sell to Chinese and European customers instead. If the United States restricts Canadian rare earth imports, Canadian processors prioritize Asian electronics manufacturers who will pay premium prices. The threat that would normally pressure Canada into accommodation actually accelerates the redirection away from American markets. American officials also cannot threaten to cut off Canadian access to American technology or American markets for Canadian finished goods, because Canada can source technology from European and Asian partners and can sell finished goods to multiple markets. The leverage that America traditionally possessed through market size and technological leadership is less effective when Canadian products are in such high demand globally that losing American market access is not catastrophic. This is the fundamental shift that generates fury. American officials are accustomed to having tools that can pressure smaller neighbors into reversing decisions that harm American interests. Those tools are not working against Canada in the domain of critical minerals because Canada controls supply of materials that America cannot easily source elsewhere. And because Canadian alternatives to American markets are substantial enough that American threats lack credibility. Let me describe what American officials have actually tried in attempting to reverse this redirection. The Biden administration offered subsidies to American manufacturers who commit to sourcing from Canadian suppliers, trying to make American contracts more attractive. Canadian suppliers took the subsidies, were offered, but did not fundamentally change allocation decisions because Chinese and European terms remained more favorable. American trade officials proposed a North American Critical Minerals Pact that would guarantee Canadian suppliers preferential access to American markets in exchange for guaranteed American access to Canadian processing. Canadian negotiators indicated interest, but insisted on terms that would classify Canadian processing as equivalent to domestic American production for all procurement purposes. American officials could not accept these terms because doing so would eliminate incentives for building domestic American processing capacity. Pentagon officials approached Canadian Defense Ministry counterparts, seeking guaranteed access to rare earth processing for American military applications. Canadian officials indicated that private companies make allocation decisions and that government cannot mandate specific customers receive priority. Pentagon officials suggested that national security considerations should override commercial decisions. Canadian officials responded that Canada's national security interests include maintaining strong relationships with multiple international partners, not just the United States. Every approach has failed to reverse the redirection because Canadian suppliers have genuine alternatives, and Canadian government officials understand that forcing suppliers to prioritize American customers would damage relationships with Asian and European partners, who are increasingly important to Canadian economic interests. The fury from figures like Trump comes from the recognition that America has lost the ability to simply demand that Canada accommodate American preferences. This represents a fundamental change in the power dynamic that governed the relationship for decades. In the previous framework, American demands were met because Canada had limited alternatives and needed American market access more than America needed Canadian resources. In the current framework, Canadian resources are scarce enough globally that Canadian suppliers can choose customers, and America is competing with other customers rather than dictating terms. Now, let me examine why this situation is durable rather than temporary. Some observers might assume that once America builds domestic processing capacity for critical minerals, Canadian leverage will diminish and traditional relationship dynamics will be restored. This assumption underestimates how long it takes to build processing capacity and overestimates how much capacity America can realistically build. Building a lithium processing facility takes 5 to 7 years from initial planning through commissioning. Building rare earth separation facilities takes even longer due to technical complexity and environmental concerns. Even with massive government subsidies and expedited permitting, American domestic processing capacity will not reach meaningful scale before the early 2030s. During this entire period, Canadian leverage will remain and will likely increase as global demand continues growing faster than supply. Moreover, even when American facilities eventually come online, they will not eliminate dependence on Canadian processing because Canadian facilities will have moved further ahead through continuous improvement and learning curve advantages. By the time American processing reaches current Canadian levels, Canadian processing will have advanced to next-generation techniques that maintain competitive advantages. Canadian suppliers also recognize that their leverage is time-limited and are using the current window to lock in long-term relationships with diverse customers. The contracts being signed now extend through the late 2020s and into the 2030s. By the time these contracts expire, the global supply landscape may have changed, but Canadian suppliers will have established themselves as reliable partners to multiple markets rather than dependent suppliers to a single dominant customer. This strategic diversification makes sense from Canadian perspective, even if it generates fury from American officials. Canada spent decades as a resource supplier heavily dependent on American markets, vulnerable to American trade actions, and constrained by the need to maintain American goodwill. The current situation provides an opportunity to reduce that dependence and build relationships that provide more balanced negotiating positions. Canadian companies and officials are seizing this opportunity because they understand it may not last indefinitely. Let me address one more aspect of why this redirection is significant beyond the immediate supply chain implications. This represents a broader pattern where middle power countries are discovering they have more autonomy than traditional alliance frameworks suggested. For decades, the assumption was that countries like Canada had limited options because they needed American security guarantees and American market access. This assumption led to expectations that these countries would defer to American preferences on most significant issues. The critical minerals situation demonstrates that this assumption no longer holds in domains where middle powers control essential resources or capabilities. Canada can make independent decisions about resource allocation because it controls processing infrastructure that larger powers need. This autonomy extends beyond resources to other policy domains where Canada previously felt constrained by American preferences. The fury from American officials reflects not just concern about specific supply chains, but recognition that the broader relationship is becoming more balanced. Canada is behaving like an independent country with diverse interests, rather than a subordinate partner whose primary orientation is toward American preferences. This shift is uncomfortable for American officials, accustomed to assuming that Canadian cooperation can be taken for granted. What makes this particularly significant is that other middle power countries are watching how Canada navigates this situation. If Canada can successfully diversify away from American dependence and maintain productive relationships with multiple major powers, other countries in similar positions will recognize they have more options than they previously assumed. This could accelerate a broader trend toward multipolarity, where middle powers play larger roles in shaping outcomes rather than simply choosing sides in great power competition. The redirection of Canadian critical minerals away from America is not just a supply chain story. It is an example of how power dynamics are shifting in a world where control over essential inputs matters more than military force or market size alone. Countries that control critical nodes in supply chains have leverage that traditional measures of power do not capture. And this leverage is durable because alternatives cannot be built quickly even by countries with enormous resources and technical capabilities. American fury at this situation is understandable. For decades, America could assume that countries like Canada would prioritize American interests because they had no realistic alternatives. That assumption is breaking down. The tools America traditionally used to enforce compliance are not effective against countries that control resources America needs. This is a new kind of power dynamic, and American officials are still learning how to navigate relationships where America is not automatically in the dominant position. The relationship between the United States and Canada is not ending, but it is maturing into something more balanced, where both sides recognize they need each other, but neither can simply dictate terms to the other. Canada needs American markets and technology. America needs Canadian processing capacity. The difference is that Canada now has alternatives good enough that American pressure is not automatically effective. And that difference changes everything about how these two countries interact. This is why American officials are scrambling to develop responses. This is why the redirection of Canadian critical minerals away from America represents more than a commercial dispute. It represents a fundamental shift in how power operates in domains where resources are scarce and alternatives are limited. And it demonstrates that the country that controls processing infrastructure can make independent decisions regardless of how much larger and more powerful its neighbor might be in traditional terms.